So I welcome all of you in this Budapest Lecture event on the eve of tomorrow's big conference on the future of Europe. And today the topic is European strategic autonomy. So in the upcoming hour, we will explore, unpack, and try to understand this old new concept, which is quite challenging. And if we are looking at European cooperation, if we are looking at the situation that Europe is in, the topic is more timely than ever. Although it has been with us for several decades. It was embraced by President Charles de Gaulle. The fall of the Berlin Wall provided an opportunity to seize it, and yet we have never been further from it than today. And we are honored to welcome Matthieu Grandpierron, who will introduce us to these questions. He's head of the political science department at the ICES-Vendée Katolikus University, and also a researcher at the École Polytechnique in France, and a visiting professor at the Shanghai University of Political Science and Law. And his research focuses on foreign policy decision-making process and the factors that can have influence on these decisions and these policies. Thank you so much, Matthieu, for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very delighted to be here. First time in Budapest, and hope it's not going to be the last one.
And let's just jump right into our conversation. But before that, I have a technical announcement. So we are going to talk like 40-45 minutes, and then I will take questions from the audience. So I encourage the audience to put forward questions through the app, so-called Slido. The event number is on the screen, and I will take and read questions in the last 15-20 minutes. So let's begin by setting the historical stage, and go back to the foundings. One of the main purposes, if we try to imagine the situation in the 50s, so one of the major purposes of establishing the European cooperation was to safeguard the European civilization against a spreading communism, a spreading hostile ideology. So establishing that cooperation right at the beginning was way beyond the economic purposes or market integration, and actually the French politics took a lead on that. If we can recall the plans of René Pleven or Charles de Gaulle, can you highlight these years and what did they mean about autonomy at that time, and how they wanted to envision that concept?
Well, I think these years were key, and it's probably where European countries did not pay that much attention to key elements. It's right from there that the question of strategic autonomy began. Being independent, yes, but from whom? Of course, you highlighted the Soviet and communist threat, but I am on the side of those who think that the American side is also threatening. If we recall now, well, not written at this time, but Zbigniew Brzezinski, so the political advisor of Carter, and when he wrote the book The Great Chessboard, wrote that Europe was either a battlefield for American geopolitics or composed of vassals. So on whether you are a battlefield or a vassal, it's not very flattering. So right from there, and if you look at the profile of those who started the European construction, Monet and the others, they were working for Roosevelt on the topic of future of Europe. But when you work in meetings on the other side of the Atlantic, of course you work from the American political side. So I'm not sure if it's the European project started truly with a pro-European idea, and at least from a pro-European view. And then, on top of that, what Europe are we talking about? Are we talking about a continent? Where does it end? Depending on where you put an end, you have to deal with Russia or without it. And at this time, at least the continent was divided. So with countries divided also, that also creates some issues. Plus independence in a specific context, countries destroyed, need to reconstruct. Most of European countries being caught in colonial warfare. France in Indochina, the Dutch in Indonesia, and so on. So that added also to many layers of challenges for which the American help needed to be secured. And then you have also the resurgence of old national rivalries. Well, France-German, that's 3 wars between 1970 until 1945, so that creates marks that at some point are or that will be that will be forgotten or not. Some that can start again to appear, and in the context also of strong leadership on both sides of the Rhine and on our side with de Gaulle, with a specific idea also of sovereignty. European construction, yes, but not against sovereignty. And when you talk about security, you have to understand where you put sovereignty in that framework, because we are talking about military, and if we talk about military, that means we have to understand what is a threat. So military defense issues have to be linked with foreign policies, and foreign policies have to be linked with who you are, identity. You can't understand a threat or identify a threat if you don't know who you are. What is threatening in terms of values, in terms of interest, so on that side. And if we look at the plan with de Gaulle, it tried, at least from French point of view, tried to balance all of his ideas. Did not work, but at least it was a try.
And what was the vision of President Charles de Gaulle in the 60s? And how they, what was the clash between that vision and the more integrationist approach in that perspective?
Well, first, it's important to understand that de Gaulle's main idea was sovereignty for France and re-establishing the greatness of France. And that's why he began, or continued and put to the next stage key elements to achieve sovereignty and independence, such as nuclear programs, either civilian and military, to have an autonomous deterrence, autonomous from the American, and to play an equilibrium force between Soviet and the US. And within the European, he called his project European Europe. So this quote in itself is interesting, not an American Europe, not a Soviet Europe, but European Europe. It goes with the idea of not a union in the sense you give powers and independence to something supranational, not abandoning competences, but it was mostly understood as a confederation, free will of cooperation, deciding up to what limit are you going to cooperate, on what topic, but sovereignty first, and then at any time the idea of we can withdraw if need be.
The next historical stage in the evolution of the European cooperation is probably the end of the 1980s, and it turned out that the initial goals of that European cooperation, of course there were debates, but it achieved its very initial goals. So it created an internal market, but also it somehow liberated Europe, of course with the help of President Ronald Reagan and many other factors, but nevertheless it was a success story. And maybe that stage of history provided an opportunity of reunification, also of redefinition of the European cooperation, and to achieve strategic goals. And it probably was set in the Maastricht Treaty. Now, my question is that in retrospect, in the last 3 decades, did Europe use this opportunity, or the European cooperation use this opportunity well, or how would you evaluate that?
Well, it's true that it was a formidable opportunity. The years between 1990 and probably 2006 or 4, around this time, at least before the 2007-8 economic crisis, this window is probably the window where everything would have been possible in terms of going forward with the European construction process, in terms also of foreign policies. USSR dissolved and new countries emerged, and it was probably the window where Europe could create its own view, its own foreign policy, its own geopolitical bloc, and play a role of equilibrium power. Part of the issues we are facing today, Ukraine war and the destabilization again of the Balkan region, all of that started in some way during this window, and probably we didn't take the right turn. It was at this moment, in terms of foreign policy, we could have engaged in a truly open window with powers on the east, but sadly, or at least my perspective, European countries only decided or thought it was economy first and then the rest later. But here again, economy, great, a free market, euro, it's very convenient, no need to change the money anymore. Open borders and so on. But in terms of crisis, with a common economy, what do you do? Is the common economy, but are all the countries at the same economic level, or do they have this? Is their economy structured the same way? And as later Greece proved, common monies proved to be difficult. In terms of foreign policies, the 90s years, early 2000 years, there was, from the way I see it, it's mostly European foreign policy, but practiced by very specific states, trying then to do first their national foreign policy and then try to engage or put the European construction behind them and carry on. Here referring to Yugoslavia, the end of Yugoslavia. It's not a European common position, but first initiative of Germany and then...
And it was something that Europe at the end could not resolve. And,
no.
And then they saw the Americans to resolve this conflict. How did they the cooperation heads of states try to draw the conclusions from that crisis?
Well, I'm not sure what conclusions have been drawn. Probably the sentimental and emotional conclusions. Well, we have to help these people in need. We can't wait further if there is pro-European values that have been in danger. But from a strategic point of view, I'm not sure that they learned the lesson. We need to be autonomous and have the means to solve crises and at our doorsteps alone without asking help. Another issue that shows that these lessons was not been learned, 2011 Libya, the Americans were called to help after 1 week because no ammunition or no means to find targets. Always and right now also with the current situation problem, well, let's call Washington. How autonomous can we be if we have to ask the help of powers outside the region?
Now, for a couple of years, it was actually President Macron who embraced and used the concept of strategic autonomy, European strategic autonomy. And actually the word, I think, is coming from him. In what context did he refer to that concept, and how many layers does it have in your view?
Well, this concept goes also with the quote, NATO is brain dead. The quotation 2019, we need European autonomous security because NATO lost its purpose, is a zombie, thus we don't know really what it's useful for, so we need something European. It's in the momentum that Emmanuel Macron thought France could take the leadership in Europe, leadership a bit abandoned after 2008 to Germany, with France being caught into economic and social turmoils, with a change of leadership styles. While in Germany there was a stable leadership under Merkel, and after the years of Merkel, the new when you have a leader for more that stays very long in power, the succession is always tricky. So that was also the context with Germany trying to figure out what to do. But France tried to take the lead, and I'm not sure, but that's because I'm not a big fan of our president. I'm not sure if he really knows what is behind the concept. Because at least European, but what is not clear is where he puts in it sovereign states. When you listen or read Emmanuel Macron's speeches, he always talks about Europe, but not of France. And when we talk about autonomous strategy, where do we put national interests in that? These questions have not been answered. Where do you put, in our case, nuclear deterrence? Do we put that? Do we include that in the package of European security, or do we keep it for ourselves? In strategic and geopolitical terms, both options leads to very, very different scenario. And right now, a couple of days ago, he opted he publicly declared that France was ready to put nuclear deterrence in favor of any European country. So that is a bit problematic. And anyway, this idea of NATO being brain dead, we need to replace it by something very and truly European, now seems to be forgotten given the Ukraine war.
Yeah, we'll circle back to the notion of sovereignty just a bit later. But before that, what you refer to is basically it's quite dangerous So you are in a dangerous situation if you are wealthy, if you have peace, if you have flourishing, economies, but you're not able to defend yourself. But in the 21st century, we are living in a globalized world. Moreover, we are living in a digitalized world, and in that global economy, economy that is partly dominated by big platform based businesses, you might be able to defend that interest as well. So if you look at strategic autonomy, how complex is this notion, and how many layers does it have in terms of market protection, investment screening, or digital sovereignty, and how would you evaluate the performance of the European cooperation in these areas?
Oh, I think we are quite late. If we look at energy, now we are facing big problems because we are making quite the impossible, meaning being against at the same time Russia, Azerbaijan plus the Gulf countries. So in terms of energy supply, I'm not sure it's wise to be against them, all of them at the same time. That leaves only one supplier, the United States. So in terms when you are dependent always from one country, it's a bit problematic. In terms of technology, we are way behind. Digital economy, yes, but that goes also where are the data centers? Where are they located? Where is the data? Currently, most of the EU data is accessible for American companies, either in terms of that can be used for marketing, surveillance, surveillance of citizens, but also surveillance of economic competitors, trying to understand what are they building to try to go ahead of them. There is the idea of, if you look at just GPS technology, Google Maps, or, well, there is no European equivalent. It's way behind and forgotten because the US put a veto on that. So that the day the United States decide that GPS system would not be available anymore for European countries, what do? It's not just for civilian purposes, it's also for military purposes. There is also the question of education, and autonomy is good, but how do you conceive it? If you have imagine you have all the resources in the world, but you don't think first you are independent, or you don't know what it means. It's not going to change much. And the problem is there is not much effort, at least, I don't know here, but in France, the shape of universities is pretty dramatic. Now the trend is for the French students to go to study abroad. They prefer to study in the UK, Canada, United States. I mean, the experience is great, but when you study abroad, there is the risk that you forgot about your own culture, your own philosophy, and begin to think like the host country. It's part of also the strategy of soft power. If you educate in your country according to your values, the elites of other countries, there is a good chance that afterwards they think like you think, and when they come to their country and are in a situation of power, they implicitly and unknowingly reproduce norms and values that suits your interest. Gramsci, Foucault, they all wrote about this. Even Lenin recognized it a long time ago. So that's also something that should be done, try to invest a lot in the culture. And then all the usual apparatus of sovereignty, foreign policy, defense industry. I'm not sure we can talk about European autonomy when a good bunch of European countries decide to buy American military equipment and not European military equipment. That raises also some question, especially given that there is always a double key procedure when you buy an American military equipment. In France, we discovered it when we bought for our Operation Barkhane in the Sahel region. We bought a Reaper's drone. And, well, we could not operate them with missiles on it because the American said no, either you use it without missiles or the drone does not fly. So when you buy an American military equipment, there is always the question, are you going to be able to use it without the agreement of Washington? Big question.
But you mentioned a very interesting thing that that autonomy and strategic autonomy at the end comes down to hearts and minds. So the way of thinking and how we learn about that in schools, and I think I would highlight that point. That might be very, very important. Before I proceed with the question, I again turn to the audience and encourage everyone to send your questions through Slido. The event number is on the screen, and in the last 15-20 minutes, I raise questions from the audience. Let's look at the last year's, big crisis situation. The war that is actually in the neighboring country. And I remember 2008 when there was a conflict between Russia and Georgia. Actually, President Sarkozy went there to negotiate and to mediate, and he went there not just in the name of France, but also in the name of Europe, or the European cooperation, and finally he succeeded. Right now, unfortunately, there was no such leadership, but let alone that, in that war, you can clearly recognize, the interest of big powers, from Russia to China, but it's less so with European countries and the European cooperation. What is the lesson that we may have to learn from that conflict, and how we should approach to that conflict?
Well, I think the lesson to learn is we became less independent. 2008, we are still in the moment that both China and Russia are quite weak, both still relying a lot on European products and technologies, especially Russia. The big reforms, military reforms, at least in France, have not been yet operated, so the army has not been decreased, and budget has not been decreased as well. So there was still the image that Europe was, or European countries were important and strong, or at least that they could have a special voice and views that were very different from the American. Right, with the continuation, 2014 Maidan and all that, it appears that, at least from what I've been able to observe in various countries, there is the image, an idea that European powers sideline always very, and more quickly every time, to the American foreign policy objectives than the previous one. So why shall we lose time engaging a discussion with European when you can call directly the boss, Washington? And there is also a difference of education between the leaders. I'm not a big fan of Sarkozy because he put France back into NATO. But when you look at Emmanuel Macron, one of the big problem, and that's why he lost also the trust. To negotiate, you need to think that the guy you are going to discuss with is trustworthy. But Emmanuel Macron leaked the recording of his talks with Vladimir Putin. It goes against every diplomatic standards. You'd never do that. And he leaked that and make fun of Vladimir Putin comments. Of course, it's not a surprise that Macron and Putin don't see the world the same way, but you never leak diplomatic recordings. And that was also that Xi Jinping said during G20 summits to Trudeau. He said, I'm not going to talk to you because you leak secret elements. And also on the ground, very specific issues, at least for the French perspective, Emmanuel Macron he decided to get rid of the diplomatic corps. So we no longer have a professional diplomats. We no longer have a professional specific school to train diplomats. Now it's the United States system, where one day you can be ambassador in a country. 3 years later, you can be working in the agriculture ministry. And 5 years later, you are somewhere else. And the consequence is now, to give you two examples that have been very, very badly interpreted. French ambassador in Moscow does not speak Russian, and French ambassador in Beijing does not speak Chinese. This is quite problematic. And from this country's perspective, these elements are understood as, one, being humiliating. Second, the idea, you are not important to us. And this lesson, at least, has been carefully observed and just thought, well, these countries are no longer either useful or trustworthy. It doesn't mean it can't change, but we are not helping us with these mistakes.
Let's just look at NATO in a very briefly. If we accept as a historical fact that it was at the end NATO who provided security for Western Europe in the Cold War and after the change of regime too. And that's the reality, that's the military alliance that serves as a reality for European countries in terms of military security. What would be, if there is any, the place of European politics within NATO?
Well,
is there any place for that?
That's a tricky question. On one side, you have a politically and military alliance, NATO, and on the other side, you have an economic political construction, the EU, without a coherent foreign policy or without the tools to have a coherent foreign policy, without also any military issues. Well, there is the so-called Franco-German brigade, which is a joke. It's purely a joke, never works. It was supposedly deployed in Sahel during the Barkhane operation. And in fact, doesn't work. Half of the brigade was under the French command, but Germany opposed that the entirety of the brigade would be there. The other half was under the United Nations command in Sahel. So one brigade, but divided into two parts, with not the same rules of engagement. So I think it illustrates well that when it comes to security or foreign policy, there is something that does not work in the EU. Either it's institutional, either it's in mentality, or simply the idea, well, NATO was there before. It's clear how it works. There is a big protector, Washington, and why should we change? After all, it provided security during the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the 80s. Why should we get rid of now? Seems to be pretty effective. Why should we? That's always when in terms of marketing, when you're satisfied or think you are satisfied with something, you change only if something works better. And for now, and given also the specific histories of some European countries, I fully understand they prefer NATO. At least they have some guarantees of support.
And my last question before I turn to the audience question, because I see there are a lot of audience question, is what you already mentioned, sovereignty, and the relation between sovereignty and strategic autonomy. And yes, you can see the question in both ways. So strategic autonomy can, on the one hand, erode sovereignty, if you conceive the concept this way, but it can also enhance member state sovereignty and independence in a, on the world stage, in which individual European countries would be too weak to promote their own interest. And my question is, what would be the ideal institutional frameworks within the European cooperation to enhance the European nation's resistance and the ability to stand on the world stage? And who would provide leadership, or is there any specific leadership that would be needed?
Well, I think the first element for any institution to work is confidence. The people and actors the institution serves need to be seen as something we can trust in. That means transparency in terms of decision-making processes, and the idea that it truly represents members' interests. So that is something strong in terms of lobby from outside the region. And from my perspective right now, the European institutions are pretty weak in terms of its capacity to resist Russian, Chinese, and American or big American companies lobbying. So that's an issue on one side, the idea of do we have confidence in it? How transparent the decision-making is? What kind of, so if something does not happen or does not work, what kind of tools do we have to oppose a bad decision or contest a bad decision? And right now I think that there is a long way for any European, or at least within the framework of the EU, there is a long way. If you look at participation rates within EU elections, that are every time lower and lower, so that reveals something, distrust. And then you mentioned it, there needs to be a spark somewhere from a leadership, either an individual leadership or a group of leaders, and with not just a vision and ideas, but also with charisma and also with material means. An alternative can't just be ideas. Ideas are wonderful, but if you can't implement, then what's the point? And I'm not sure we have all of that right now. I'm not sure we have leaders that are courageous enough to dare say, okay, we are America, we like you, but that stops here. Interest, we may have different interests that you have, and you need to accept it. On the other side, differently, what means do we have to protect ourselves from probably retaliation, from being not all automatically aligned on other protectors? Just imagine just imagine all the sanctions implemented, put against Russia. If there's 2,000 and stop counting sanctions have been implemented on any European country or on the EU, how long would have been able to resist? Not very long. So there's also the need to. That's why it's tricky. You need the leader, the ideas, and also the will to change things, to get the tools to be able to implement it.
Thank you for highlighting that. We have pretty good questions, and I will start with the green transition. So, how successful is the EU building its strategic autonomy in connection with green transition, especially critical raw materials, hydrogen supply, and circular economy?
Well, that's another tricky one as well. Green energy is fantastic, of course, and as the question highlighted, the problem is where do you get the raw materials from? China, North Korea, or Russia? That's you have a choice. But if we talk about wind energy, most of what is required to build a wind farm comes from China. There is, of course, and that is a French saying it, so nuclear energy, which at least does not rely on natural conditions, because if you don't have wind, the wind energy, but nuclear is right now the safest, unless you build a nuclear plant next to earthquake zone, of course. But it's relatively safe with new technologies, and you have an unlimited source of power that is currently in Europe the cheapest. So that is one solution. But for this, you also need technicity, special engineers, and when you look at European technologies, we were during the 80s, 90s, we were ahead of a competition, and now we are way behind China and the United States. So this is also problematic.
And a related question, what strategies can the European Union employ to uphold its interests and values in the face of growing economic interdependence?
First, it needs to define its interest. And that is also a question of mentality. As European, what is our interest? What kind of natural resources do we have? What kind of natural resources we don't have? And where can we buy it in terms of, first, reliability and economic cost? So that's one. And there's answers to these questions are not in line with what's called political correctness, or some answers to strategies or issues, or where to get supply from, sometimes, and mostly often, do not get aligned with moral values. So there's also the need to accept that at some point, well, if you want to do business, you have to do business also with the bad guys. Otherwise, the choice of business is very limited. 27 EU members plus Canada and United States, and it's finished. Well, we can think this, but I'm not sure if it's a good choice. And so first, identifying what interest do we have, and then what is the best way to achieve these objectives. But that needs to have a coherent decision-making process, and to have also decision-makers that view or feel like European and accept to have a separate voice, an autonomous voice, that can, depending on the interest, align with Washington, Beijing, or Moscow. After all, that was it shouldn't be hard. It is what we were doing in Europe since Westphalia and even before. Not humiliating the one you were winning against at this moment, because maybe in 5 years he would have been your ally in the next war against your former ally. And that is a lesson that has been lost. Europe was that center of equilibrium and multipolarity and very fluid diplomacy, and now we are in a sort of kind of positivist, very I'm trying to find the word, very unsophisticated way of thinking.
And sometimes what is good and what is bad is just lies in the eyes of the beholder. And I think the next question somehow relates to that. How can the next election in the US influence Europe's strategic autonomy?
Can you just repeat the first?
How can the next election in the United States, so the November president's election, influence the strategic autonomy of Europe?
Yes. I think it depends who is elected. If you look at no, I mean just because it matters if it's a liberal or a Democrat or Republican. If you look at
it's Donald Trump or Biden, yeah.
Yes,
Biden.
I think if it's Trump, it would be it gives Europe a better chance for two reasons. One, historically speaking, when a Republican has been in power in Washington, Europe always had more room of maneuver. There is a sort of idea that, at least in the media and the global opinion, the Democrats are the liberals, so they are the good guy, so we are going to do just like them, it's your best friend. And the Republican is, well, can we really trust him? And it was really the case with Donald Trump. Because even before COVID, if you remember well, EU for China was more friendly than Donald Trump. They were in line with and agreeing to do more trade and forget about many things, internal issues of China, because they hated more Donald Trump. So if Trump wins, just because his personality is very specific and creates a clear-cut, dichotomous positioning, it's no middle ground with him, and giving his also idea that NATO costs too much for the United States, maybe that would be a good solution. To whether we like it or not, it will maybe put us in the situation where we have to take problems in our own hands. So.
Thank you for highlighting that. We have time for one remaining last question. And there is a question about Europe as being a prisoner of a very idealist and universalist mirage or image. And how we can escape? How can the European cooperation escape from that illusion?
Well, I think the first, what matters is to reconciliate every people and population with different elements such as their national history and the concept of nation. There is the trap of international liberalism leads to think the world as something united. No differences between civilization and values. We are all the same. Concepts meaning the same thing everywhere. Democracy in Europe equals democracy in Asia, equals democracy in Africa, the same definition. And I'm not sure we can say that European culture or cultures of European countries is equally the same as the culture of Japan, Indonesia, Australia. We are not all the same. And just by traveling, you recognize it. But with international liberalism, there is first this idea that everything is the same. That means that if something is not exactly like us, then it's either bad or it's not the same thing. And there is the idea to convert the other. That was the idea of Fukuyama. Let's make the world all democratic, and then there won't be any problem anymore. And we saw what this led to. We can ask the Somalian, the Syrian, the Afghan, and the Iraqi. They feel safer now and better since we provide them with democracy.
And the history will end, but it turned out that the history
Yes,
won't end.
And there is also something that needs to be taken care of, is how we fight cancel culture. This is very important. We are all the product of history, whether we like it or not. History is a collection of pleasant events, unpleasant events, positive things, and atrocities. But all of this, all what happened in the past, first, we are not going to change it, unless we invent a time travel machine, which is also very unlikely. And second, all the good and bad events produce what we are and who we are. And if we decide to start to pick things within history to define who we are losing the identity. And it's the first, I think, battleground is to reconcile us with what we have done in the past and acknowledge that now we have to move on, and this past event define who we are. And we don't need to also make the same mistakes, but culture is very important.
Thank you. That's a very good end note. Thank you so much for educating us, for shedding light on this very complex problem. And I think we are closer to understand this challenge. And as for now, please give a nice big round of applause to our wonderful panelist, Matthieu.
Well, thank you very much for the questions and the invitation.